Imagine a world where the stories of millions of people have been forgotten, hidden behind layers of time and selective memory. Today, we begin an exploration of one of the least discussed yet profoundly impactful chapters of human history, the Arab slave trade. Long before European ships crossed the Atlantic, before the Atlantic slave trade gained notoriety, Arab traders had already begun forcibly removing millions of Africans from their homelands. This was not a brief episode, but a practice that spanned over 13 centuries, leaving scars that shaped generations and altered the course of entire communities. The magnitude of this history is staggering. From the deserts of the Sahara to the shores of the Red Sea, from the bustling markets of Cairo and Baghdad to the distant islands of the Indian Ocean, African men, women, and children were captured, sold, and transported under brutal conditions. Entire societies were affected as families were torn apart and communities were disrupted. The trade was driven by economic ambition, political power, and social structures that allowed human beings to be treated as commodities. As we journey through this story, we will uncover the experiences of those who endured unimaginable hardship. We will examine how young boys were subjected to castration, a cruel practice intended to prevent them from reproducing and asserting control over entire populations. We will see the struggles of families forced to walk through harsh deserts, carrying heavy burdens and facing hunger, thirst, and disease. And we will understand the wide-ranging impact on African societies, from depopulation to long-lasting social trauma. But this is more than a story of suffering. It is also a story of resilience and strength. Despite centuries of oppression, African communities preserved their culture, identity, and human dignity. Remembering this history is not about comparing evils, but about acknowledging the profound consequences of human actions and learning from them. As we explore this hidden history, I invite you to join us in uncovering these stories. By understanding the Arab slave trade, we gain insight into the broader patterns of human behavior, the enduring impact of systemic injustice, and the resilience of those who survived against all odds. If you find this journey enlightening and eye-opening, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue to bring these untold stories to light, ensuring that the voices of millions are not lost to history. Share this video with friends and family. And together, let us explore the depths of history, reflect on its lessons, and honor the memory of those whose stories have long been silenced. Even as the world began to confront the moral atrocity of slavery, the practice persisted in many parts of the Arab world, often hidden in plain sight, woven into the social and economic fabric of nations such as Saudi Arabia and Yemen, where generations lived under a system that treated human beings as property. Families were torn apart, children were separated from their parents, and men and women were subjected to conditions that left lasting scars on both body and spirit, as the long shadows of centuries-old practices refused to dissipate. While Europe and the Americas began to outlaw slavery, legislating against the very concept of owning another human being, many Arab nations maintained traditions that had been in place for over 1,000 years, where the status of individuals as slaves was normalized and rarely questioned within local communities. In this context, Mauritania became a particularly notable case. It was one of the last countries in the world to officially abolish slavery in 1981, decades after most nations had outlawed the practice. Yet even the decree abolishing slavery in Mauritania did not immediately translate into freedom for those who had been subjected to it, as the legal structures and enforcement mechanisms required to protect former slaves were weak, inconsistent, and often influenced by the lingering social acceptance of the old ways. The reality was that while a law on paper signaled change, the lives of many continued under the weight of historical oppression, with former slaves finding themselves still economically dependent, socially marginalized, and psychologically burdened by the legacy of bondage. This period illuminates the complex interplay between legislation, social attitudes, and human rights, revealing that abolishing slavery is not merely a question of passing a law, but requires dismantling entrenched systems of inequality and prejudice that have persisted for generations. Across these nations, the transition from centuries of normalized servitude to a society that recognized the fundamental rights and dignity of every individual was neither smooth nor immediate. Instead, it was marked by ongoing struggles, with activists and ordinary people pushing against deep-rooted traditions that had long justified human exploitation. The persistence of slavery into the late 20th century underscores the resilience of historical systems of oppression and the slow pace at which societal norms can evolve, emphasizing that legal decrees, while essential, are only one part of a broader, multifaceted struggle for justice. By examining the stories of those who lived through this era in countries like Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Mauritania, we gain insight into the ways cultural, economic, and political factors combine to prolong the suffering of enslaved people, even in a time when the global consensus increasingly condemned such practices. These narratives are crucial for understanding how slavery did not end uniformly across the world, and how the effects of prolonged subjugation continue to echo through societies that struggled to dismantle these systems. The experiences of individuals and communities affected by late-stage slavery in the Arab world provide a stark reminder that freedom, justice, and equality are not automatically achieved through legislation alone, but require sustained social commitment, education, and the persistent challenging of outdated norms that condone or ignore human exploitation. As we trace the journey from centuries of entrenched slavery to the eventual formal abolition in Mauritania, it becomes clear that the resilience and courage of those who resisted, survived, and sought to assert their humanity in the face of systemic oppression are central to the broader historical narrative, highlighting both the enduring impact of slavery and the ongoing responsibility of contemporary society to remember, educate, and prevent the repetition of such injustices. By exploring this chapter in depth, we not only honor the memories of those who suffered but also gain perspective on the complexities of societal transformation and the slow but critical progress toward recognizing and upholding the rights and dignity of all human beings. Amid the long and tragic history of slavery in the Arab world, one of the most harrowing and deeply unsettling practices was the castration of young African males, a calculated act designed to control the reproductive potential of enslaved populations and assert absolute dominance over their lives. These boys, often captured at a tender age, were removed from their homes and families, subjected to treacherous journeys across deserts, and placed in unfamiliar and hostile environments where survival itself was uncertain. The moment of castration represented not merely a physical mutilation, but a profound severing of identity, dignity, and future possibilities, marking the victims in ways that extended far beyond the immediate pain. It was a practice that combined elements of economic calculation, social manipulation, and psychological subjugation, revealing the depths to which human cruelty can be systematized when society condones and even profits from such inhumanity. As these young boys were led into the confines of castration houses, often located in the trade centers of major cities, the air was thick with fear and despair, and the cries of those who came before them lingered as a grim warning. The procedure, frequently carried out with rudimentary tools and limited medical knowledge, was fraught with risk, and many did not survive the operation, succumbing to infection, hemorrhage, or shock. Those who did endure were left physically altered, with lifelong consequences that affected their health, strength, and hormonal balance, while also bearing the invisible scars of trauma that would haunt their minds and spirits indefinitely. These individuals were transformed from adolescents with futures of potential and family lineage into eunuchs, removed from the possibility of fatherhood and stripped of one of the fundamental aspects of their humanity, creating a legacy of both personal suffering and societal disruption. The practice of castration was not a random act of violence, but was deeply intertwined with the economic and social structures of Arab societies at the time, where eunuchs were highly valued as trusted servants, palace guards, and custodians of harems. Their perceived loyalty and inability to procreate made them ideal candidates for roles that required absolute obedience, and they were often sold at higher prices in slave markets than their uncastrated counterparts, creating a cruel incentive for traders to continue this practice despite its brutality. The systemic nature of castration demonstrates the lengths to which human societies have gone to manipulate and commodify bodies for profit, embedding suffering into everyday transactions and normalizing acts of extreme cruelty within institutional frameworks. Beyond the immediate physical consequences, the psychological impact of castration was profound. Boys who were taken from their communities and subjected to this irreversible procedure faced a lifetime of isolation, stigma, and alienation from their roots and culture. Removed from the possibility of forming traditional families, they were often placed in roles that emphasized control and obedience, reinforcing a sense of powerlessness and disconnection from their heritage. Entire regions of Africa experienced demographic shifts as a result, with young males disappearing from villages, altering the social and familial structures that had sustained communities for generations. The trauma rippled through families who lost sons and brothers, and the memory of these acts lingered in the collective consciousness, shaping the psychological landscape of affected societies for centuries. Stories recorded by travelers, missionaries, and historians paint a picture of the immense suffering endured by these young males, and the accounts often evoke a profound sense of sorrow and disbelief at the calculated cruelty involved. Observers documented the long journeys across harsh deserts, the brutal treatment by overseers, and the harrowing experiences within slave markets and castration facilities, providing a vivid testimony to the human cost of these practices. These narratives help us understand not only the individual pain, but also the broader social consequences, including disrupted family lines, weakened communities, and the long-term effects on population dynamics in regions heavily affected by the slave trade. The legacy of castration within the Arab slave trade serves as a stark reminder of the dehumanizing effects of systemic oppression and the ways in which economic, social, and political incentives can converge to perpetuate cruelty on a massive scale. It underscores the resilience of those who survived such experiences and highlights the importance of documenting and acknowledging these histories, even when they are uncomfortable or difficult to confront. Recognizing the profound impact of these practices allows us to better appreciate the depth of human suffering inflicted by the slave trade and the ongoing necessity of remembering and educating future generations to prevent the repetition of such atrocities. Through the lens of history, the castration of young African males emerges not only as an act of individual cruelty, but as a reflection of the broader mechanisms of control, exploitation, and commodification that characterized the Arab slave trade. It reminds us that the struggle for human dignity, freedom, and justice has been long and arduous, shaped by acts of unimaginable suffering, and that the stories of those who endured must remain at the center of our understanding of this dark chapter. By confronting these truths, we honor the resilience of those who survived, acknowledge the enduring consequences of historical injustices, and reinforce our commitment to recognizing and upholding the intrinsic value and humanity of every individual across time and place. Between AD 650 and 1900, the scope of the Arab slave trade reached staggering proportions, reshaping the lives of millions of Africans and leaving indelible marks on the societies from which they were taken and the lands to which they were forcibly transported. It is estimated that between 10 and 20 million Africans were captured, sold, and moved across vast and unforgiving landscapes, their journeys spanning the scorching sands of the Sahara, the bustling ports of the Middle East, and the distant shores of the Indian Ocean. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a sustained system of human exploitation that persisted for over a millennium. A network of commerce and control that depended upon the systematic dehumanization of entire communities and generations. Families were torn apart, children separated from parents, and young men and women stripped of their freedom, culture, and identities, their fates determined by distant powers driven by profit, prestige, and social dominance. The process of enslavement began with raids on villages and towns, where men, women, and children were taken with little regard for their humanity. Captives were often forced to march long distances under the blazing sun, carrying heavy loads, or shackled in chains that allowed no comfort or reprieve, while overseers maintained strict control through violence and intimidation. The Sahara Desert, with its endless stretches of sand and punishing heat, became an unforgiving corridor of suffering where thousands perished before even reaching the markets where they would be sold. Those who survived were then subjected to the further hardships of transport by sea and land, packed into ships and caravans, often with insufficient food and water, enduring conditions so extreme that mortality rates were horrifically high. The journey itself was an ordeal that broke the body and spirit, creating a lasting imprint of fear, despair, and resilience in the memories of those who lived to recount their experiences. Once the enslaved reached their destinations in the Middle East or across the Indian Ocean, they encountered a wide range of roles that were often dictated by their age, gender, and perceived utility. Young boys might be castrated to serve as eunuchs in royal courts or harems, a practice that, while providing economic advantage to traders and status to owners, inflicted lifelong physical and psychological trauma upon the victims. Girls and women were frequently assigned to domestic labor or sexual servitude. Living under constant surveillance and control, men could be pressed into hard labor, serving as soldiers, agricultural workers, or construction laborers, often subjected to brutal treatment and denied the most basic human rights. Across these regions, the enslaved contributed to the economic prosperity of their owners, while their personal suffering remained largely invisible to the wider world. Their lives reduced to commodities in a system that measured human worth in terms of productivity, obedience, and market value. Historians and travelers documented these journeys and conditions, providing crucial insight into the magnitude of suffering and the complexity of the trade networks. Accounts describe the long caravan routes across deserts, the tightly packed ships crossing the Indian Ocean, and the bustling slave markets of Cairo, Baghdad, Mecca, and other key cities, where human beings were examined, priced, and sold with clinical detachment. These narratives reveal not only the physical toll endured by the captives, but also the profound social and cultural disruption inflicted upon African societies. As the loss of young men and women weakened familial structures, altered population dynamics, and reshaped local economies, entire villages were depopulated or destabilized, leaving lasting effects on communities that reverberated through generations, a testament to the long-term consequences of this extensive human exploitation. The magnitude of the Arab slave trade also highlights the intersection of commerce, politics, and ideology. In many regions, slavery was justified through religious, cultural, or legal rationales, providing moral cover for acts of extreme cruelty and exploitation. These justifications enabled the continuation of the trade over centuries, allowing it to persist even as other parts of the world began to recognize and legislate against the inhumanity of enslavement. The combined forces of economic gain, social hierarchy, and ideological endorsement created a self-reinforcing system that endured far longer than might be expected in an increasingly interconnected and morally aware world, illustrating the challenges of dismantling entrenched practices that are embedded in both society and governance. Beyond the individual suffering and societal disruption, the scale of the trade had profound demographic and cultural implications. Populations were shifted, families dismantled, and entire regions experienced long-term consequences that affected development. Social cohesion and cultural continuity, the stories of survival and resilience, however, reveal the enduring human spirit, as those who lived through enslavement sought to maintain their identity, culture, and sense of self in environments designed to strip them of these very things. These accounts underscore the importance of historical memory and the need to recognize the depth and breadth of suffering inflicted upon millions of people across continents and centuries. By examining the period from 650 to 1900, we gain a clearer understanding of the extraordinary scale and persistence of the Arab slave trade, its mechanisms of control, and its human cost. The trade reshaped societies, economies, and cultural landscapes, leaving legacies that remain visible in historical memory and contemporary discourse. In confronting these truths, we honor the experiences of those who endured unimaginable hardships, acknowledge the systemic forces that perpetuated suffering, and reaffirm the responsibility of present and future generations to educate, remember, and act to prevent such exploitation from ever occurring again. This history, marked by cruelty, resilience, and the struggle for human dignity, forms an essential chapter in the broader story of slavery and human endurance, compelling us to reflect on the past and its lessons for our shared future. The journey of enslaved Africans under the Arab slave trade was a harrowing ordeal that defies simple description, a grueling testament to the extremes of human suffering and endurance that accompanied centuries of forced displacement, exploitation, and dehumanization. From the moment they were captured, often in the dead of night during raids on villages or towns, their lives became defined by a relentless march into uncertainty, fear, and pain. Young and old alike were forced to traverse vast and unforgiving landscapes, the endless deserts of Africa serving as both barrier and prison, a harsh crucible that tested the limits of physical and mental endurance. Shackled in chains or tethered together, they were compelled to carry heavy burdens, to endure scorching sun and frigid nights, while overseers ensured that any hesitation or faltering was met with brutal punishment, leaving no room for rest, mercy, or humanity. The desert itself became an instrument of oppression, its arid winds and unrelenting heat exacting a toll on bodies already weakened by fear, hunger, and deprivation, and countless lives were claimed before the captives even reached the markets that awaited them in distant lands. The specter of starvation hovered over these marches, as the captives were provided with barely enough sustenance to continue moving, their rations insufficient to maintain strength or stave off the creeping exhaustion that threatened to collapse both body and spirit. Many succumbed not only to hunger but to disease, the result of cramped conditions, exposure to harsh environments, and weakened immune systems, while those who fell behind were often executed to set an example or simply abandoned to the merciless elements, their cries swallowed by the vast silence of the desert. In comparison to the horrors of the Atlantic slave trade, where Africans endured the brutal Middle Passage across the ocean, the overland journeys of the Arab trade proved often more lethal, as the combination of relentless marching, inadequate provisions, and extreme environmental conditions created an almost continuous attrition of human life that decimated entire groups before they could even reach their destinations. Upon arrival in market cities such as Cairo, Baghdad, or Mecca, the surviving captives were thrust into a new reality of exploitation, where the initial trauma of capture was compounded by the dehumanizing mechanics of slavery itself. They were sold into roles that varied according to gender, age, and the whims of their new owners, yet all were subjected to conditions that stripped them of autonomy, dignity, and any semblance of safety. Men might be pressed into labor-intensive work in fields, mines, or military units, their bodies further tested and weakened after weeks of starvation and dehydration, while women were often assigned to domestic service or sexual exploitation. Living under the constant surveillance and control of masters whose interest lay solely in their obedience and utility, the enduring consequences of these journeys and the subsequent conditions of servitude left profound physical, psychological, and social scars, not only on the individuals themselves but on the societies from which they were taken, reshaping family structures, community cohesion, and demographic patterns across vast regions of Africa. Eyewitness accounts and historical records offer haunting glimpses into the suffering endured along these desert routes. Travelers and missionaries described lines of captives moving in seemingly endless columns, their bodies emaciated, their faces marked by exhaustion, fear, and despair, and the relentless cruelty of overseers who wielded whips, sticks, or other implements of pain to enforce compliance. Children, some no older than 7 or 8, were forced to march alongside adults, their small bodies ill-equipped to endure the punishing conditions, many falling by the wayside, never to rise again. Mothers clung to their children where they could, yet the pressures of the journey often forced heart-wrenching choices and tragic losses. And the desert claimed more than just physical vitality, it stripped away hope, familial bonds, and the sense of safety that once defined home and community. The desert, with its shifting sands and oppressive heat, became a symbol of suffering, a constant and unyielding adversary that tested endurance beyond what might seem humanly possible. The psychological toll of these journeys was no less severe than the physical hardships endured. The constant uncertainty, the fear of violence, and the witnessing of death around them created lasting trauma, searing memories of helplessness and terror that followed survivors into their lives of forced servitude. Families and communities lost members, and the fabric of social and cultural continuity was torn apart, leaving gaps that would influence generations, as entire villages and regions were depopulated of young men and women. The survivors, while sometimes able to build new lives within the oppressive structures they were placed into, carried with them the weight of these experiences, their identities reshaped by the cruelty endured and the profound injustices inflicted upon them and their people. Even as time passed and the Arab slave trade waned under international and domestic pressures, the memories and legacies of these desert marches and the suffering endured continued to shape the collective consciousness of affected African communities. Historians and scholars recognize the immense human cost, not only in the loss of life but in the enduring psychological and social consequences, understanding that the high mortality rates, extreme deprivation, and relentless abuse along the desert routes constituted a human tragedy of immense scale. These journeys highlight the resilience of those who survived, the strength of communities that endured, and the necessity of acknowledging, recording, and remembering these histories to ensure that the full extent of suffering and endurance is neither forgotten nor diminished. By tracing the experiences of enslaved Africans during these desert marches, we come to comprehend the scale and intensity of the Arab slave trade in a manner that emphasizes both individual suffering and systemic cruelty. The grueling treks across deserts, coupled with starvation, abuse, and disease, underscore a chapter of human history marked by immense hardship, resilience, and the enduring struggle for dignity in the face of relentless oppression. Remembering these journeys allows us to honor the victims, recognize the consequences of historical injustices, and commit to understanding the depth of human endurance and the moral imperatives that history imposes upon us. Once the harrowing journey across deserts, seas, and distant lands was complete, the lives of enslaved Africans did not find respite. Instead, they were thrust into a new chapter of relentless toil and unyielding subjugation. Their labor demanded in nearly every sphere of the societies that had claimed them, from the grand palaces and private homes of the Middle East to the arid plantations stretching across distant territories. Africans were pressed into service in ways that exploited both their physical capacities and the social vulnerabilities imposed upon them by their status as property. Young men and boys often became soldiers or guards, placed in positions that required not only strength but also the harsh obedience demanded by masters who wielded absolute control over their fates. Within the intimate confines of palaces and households, others were employed as harem attendants, charged with monitoring and managing the spaces where women lived, a role that carried both prestige and peril, often entwined with the broader dynamics of trust, hierarchy, and surveillance that defined these elite environments. Women and girls, meanwhile, were frequently forced into domestic labor, responsible for cooking, cleaning, and performing endless tasks that sustained households and institutions while offering no compensation or freedom. Many were placed in the service of the powerful, becoming attendants, companions, or servants in wealthy homes, their every action scrutinized and their autonomy entirely constrained. Others faced the cruel reality of sexual exploitation, a grim reality that left deep scars and compounded the trauma of displacement, as their bodies became sites of economic and social control rather than expressions of personal agency. Across the wider economic landscape, African laborers were indispensable in agriculture, tending plantations that produced the commodities fueling wealth and trade for distant rulers and merchants. Their work grueling, often in extreme climates, with little relief or recognition. In addition to these roles, some Africans were conscripted into the most dangerous industries, places where the risks to life were exceptionally high and where laborers were exposed to conditions that left them vulnerable to injury, disease, and death. Salt mines, for example, were notorious for their harsh environment, with workers enduring relentless heat, dust, and the physical demands of extracting a vital resource essential to both preservation and commerce. Similarly, construction projects, hydraulic works, and other labor-intensive enterprises required immense exertion, with masters indifferent to the suffering endured, focused solely on the productivity and utility of those they enslaved. The deployment of enslaved Africans across such a wide spectrum of labor not only amplified the scope of their exploitation, but also reflected the pervasiveness of the system, in which every facet of society could harness the labor and bodies of the captives for economic, social, or political gain. Historical accounts describe the extreme conditions under which these individuals lived and worked, offering vivid testimony to the resilience and suffering that characterized their lives. Observers such as missionaries, travelers, and scholars documented the constant toil, the cruelty inflicted for disobedience or perceived inadequacy, and the omnipresent threat of punishment that maintained order and compliance. In the harem, attendants navigated complex hierarchies, while soldiers faced life-threatening assignments that demanded both loyalty and endurance. In the fields and mines, laborers confronted exhausting physical work, exposure to disease, and frequent abuse. Through these narratives, the human cost of such widespread exploitation becomes starkly apparent, highlighting not only the immediate suffering of those enslaved, but also the enduring psychological and social consequences that followed. The systemic use of African captives in diverse roles also disrupted the societies from which they were taken. By removing large segments of young men and women, entire communities were destabilized, familial structures dismantled, and economic systems disrupted, leaving long-term effects that rippled through generations. The absence of these individuals meant that traditional social and cultural practices were interrupted, knowledge and skills were lost or diverted, and the demographic balance of regions was altered. Meanwhile, in the lands where they were forcibly transported, Africans contributed to the economic and social frameworks of societies that depended on their labor. Yet their contributions were rendered invisible within narratives that denied them agency and humanity. In some instances, the skills and abilities of enslaved Africans were leveraged in ways that shaped cultural and social landscapes, even as their freedom remained denied. Soldiers and guards maintained the security and power of rulers, their service ensuring the continuity of political and military structures, while skilled laborers and artisans contributed to the material and infrastructural development of their environments. Domestic workers shaped the functioning of households and communities, sustaining the daily rhythms of life and culture, while those pressed into the most dangerous work exemplified both the extremes of human endurance and the ruthless calculations of a system that valued human life only in terms of utility. The physical and psychological toll of these roles cannot be overstated, as prolonged exposure to harsh labor, abuse, and constant surveillance inflicted enduring consequences. Enslaved individuals often suffered malnutrition, chronic injury, and mental anguish, their identities shaped by the relentless demands imposed upon them. Yet within these stories of hardship are also threads of resilience, survival, and adaptation, as individuals found ways to navigate oppressive systems, maintain connections with cultural roots, and assert agency where possible, preserving elements of identity and humanity even in circumstances designed to strip them away. Ultimately, the use of Africans as domestic workers, harem guards, soldiers, plantation laborers, and participants in hazardous industries illustrates the breadth and depth of exploitation inherent in the Arab slave trade. It underscores the ways in which systems of power relied on human subjugation for economic and social gain, and it invites reflection on the enduring legacy of these practices on both the societies that perpetrated them and the communities from which enslaved individuals were taken. Through remembering these histories, we acknowledge the human cost, honor the resilience of those who endured, and gain insight into the mechanisms of oppression and survival that shaped this dark and complex chapter of human history, compelling us to confront its lessons with honesty, empathy, and commitment to human dignity. The ramifications of castration and widespread enslavement extended far beyond the immediate suffering of those captured. They reverberated across African societies, leaving scars that would shape communities for generations and profoundly altering the social, cultural, and demographic landscape of the continent. In regions from which large numbers of young men and boys were taken, entire villages experienced sudden and catastrophic shifts in their population structure. The removal of males in their prime not only reduced the workforce necessary for agriculture, defense, and economic productivity but also disrupted the natural processes of family formation, community leadership, and social cohesion, creating voids that were difficult, if not impossible, to fill. Young men were often the backbone of local society, responsible for cultivating land, defending settlements, and passing down traditions. Their absence destabilized the balance of communities and forced families and neighbors into roles for which they were unprepared, while simultaneously leaving women and the elderly to shoulder extraordinary burdens, often in isolation and under extreme duress. The practice of castration compounded these societal disruptions in uniquely insidious ways. By physically preventing young men from reproducing, Arab slave traders not only ensured that captives could not form families in captivity, but also created lasting demographic consequences in the regions where these men were taken. Gender ratios became heavily skewed, as the systematic removal and incapacitation of males left many communities bereft of the natural complement needed for social and familial continuity. This imbalance had cascading effects. The absence of male populations contributed to economic stagnation, as labor-intensive tasks were left undone. Social hierarchies were destabilized, as traditional structures depended on the presence of adult men, and cultural practices, including rites of passage, leadership succession, and the transmission of oral histories and skills, were disrupted, leaving entire generations of Africans without the guidance and mentorship necessary to sustain the fabric of their societies. Beyond these structural consequences, the psychological and emotional trauma inflicted by enslavement and castration penetrated deep into the collective consciousness of affected communities. Families who lost sons, brothers, and fathers grappled with grief, fear, and helplessness, while children and survivors carried the memory of suffering into adulthood, shaping not only personal identities but also communal narratives and collective memory. Stories of missing loved ones, of villages emptied of young men, and of the cruelty inflicted upon those who were taken became woven into the social fabric, influencing how communities perceive security, trust, and human relationships for generations. The trauma was not limited to those captured. Entire societies bore witness to the violence and its consequences, instilling a pervasive sense of vulnerability and the knowledge that social and familial stability could be destroyed by forces beyond their control. The economic impact of this disruption was equally profound. Agricultural production suffered as fields went untended and labor-intensive tasks could not be completed, undermining local food security and trade networks. Communities that had previously thrived faced scarcity, forcing reliance on neighboring regions or external powers for survival, and in some cases, prompting cycles of conflict and migration as people sought safety, resources, or means to rebuild what had been lost. The absence of men capable of defending settlements also left communities exposed to further raids, perpetuating a vicious cycle in which vulnerability bred vulnerability, and the predations of slave traders reinforced the very instability that enabled their operations to continue unchecked. Cultural and social traditions were similarly affected. Initiation rites, leadership selection, and ceremonial practices that relied on the presence of a balanced population and the transmission of knowledge from elders to youth were interrupted, and in many cases, lost entirely. Communities that once relied on intergenerational mentorship found themselves lacking the personnel to maintain these structures, resulting in the erosion of cultural continuity. Oral histories, local knowledge, and ancestral wisdom were interrupted, and in some regions, the loss of a generation of men meant that these traditions had to be reconstructed or risked being permanently forgotten. The emotional weight of these absences compounded the material deprivation, embedding a sense of loss and disorientation that shaped how communities rebuilt themselves in the aftermath of such extensive human disruption. The physical and psychological impacts on the captives themselves added yet another layer to this legacy. Castrated individuals who survived the ordeal endured lifelong health consequences, including hormonal imbalances, physical weakness, and susceptibility to disease, while the social isolation inherent in their condition separated them from both the societies they were taken from and those into which they were placed. Many eunuchs were employed in roles within palaces, harems, and administrative structures, yet even these positions of perceived utility could not replace the profound losses experienced through forced separation from family, community, and homeland. Their lived experience became a testament to the enduring costs of human exploitation, demonstrating the interconnectedness of personal suffering and societal destabilization in ways that resonate across history. Over generations, the compounded effects of these practices contributed to lasting demographic, economic, and social imbalances in regions affected by the Arab slave trade. Communities that had once been self-sustaining found themselves vulnerable, with cultural practices disrupted, economic systems weakened, and social cohesion strained to the breaking point. Survivors and their descendants carried the memory of trauma and loss into the future, shaping identities, cultural narratives, and collective memory in ways that remain visible even centuries later. The legacy of castration and mass enslavement is not only a matter of historical record. It is a living testament to the ways in which human actions, driven by greed, power, and prejudice, can inflict consequences that extend far beyond the immediate victims, affecting entire societies and future generations. By examining the intertwined effects of physical mutilation, forced displacement, and systemic enslavement, we gain insight into the profound and enduring impact these practices had on African communities. We see how demographic imbalances, disrupted social structures, and generational trauma were inextricably linked, and how the experiences of individuals, families, and entire societies were shaped by the complex, often brutal, mechanisms of the slave trade. Reflecting on this history allows us not only to honor the resilience and survival of those affected, but also to understand the deep structural and cultural consequences of human exploitation, ensuring that the lessons of the past inform our engagement with justice, memory, and human dignity today. In the intricate economy of the Arab world during the height of the trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean slave trades, the value assigned to human life was starkly and chillingly quantified, and among the most prized commodities were castrated males, or eunuchs, whose physical alteration paradoxically elevated their status in markets where human beings were bought and sold like goods, reflecting a system in which economic incentive intersected with social utility to perpetuate one of the most inhumane practices imaginable. From the moment a young African male was seized, often violently torn from his village and family, his future was inextricably tied to a trajectory dictated not by his abilities, character, or aspirations, but by the brutal calculation of profit and the perceived advantages his altered body could provide to the powerful households and institutions of the Arab world. Traders, aware that eunuchs commanded substantially higher prices than non-castrated captives, pursued this practice with relentless efficiency, establishing castration as a routine, if horrifying, step in the chain of commerce that transformed children into commodities whose bodies were engineered to fulfill market demands. The motivations behind this practice were multifaceted, blending economic calculation with social and cultural expectations. Eunuchs were considered uniquely reliable and trustworthy within elite households, tasked with roles that required both intimate access and absolute obedience, such as overseeing harems, guarding royal women, or administering the internal functions of palaces and courts, positions in which their inability to reproduce was perversely interpreted as a mark of loyalty and absence of threat. Slave owners believed that castrated males would be less likely to pursue personal desires that could disrupt social hierarchies or challenge authority, making them ideal servants in environments where trust and control were paramount. As a result, the physical violation of castration was justified through a twisted combination of economic pragmatism and social logic, and the profitability of these individuals reinforced a vicious cycle in which more young boys were targeted, altered, and sold at premium prices. Historical records and travelers' accounts reveal the meticulous, cold calculation that surrounded the trade in eunuchs. Castration was performed with limited regard for survival, and yet the high market value incentivized traders to perfect and sustain the practice, balancing the risk of mortality against the profit to be gained. In Venetian and Ottoman records, for instance, the demand for eunuchs in the palaces and administrative centers of Istanbul and other major cities ensured that even the mortal dangers of the procedure could not deter its widespread continuation. For those who survived, life as a eunuch was one of both relative privilege and perpetual alienation. Their elevated status in economic terms did little to repair the psychological trauma of being forcibly removed from homeland, family, and community, nor did it erase the lifelong consequences of the physical mutilation they endured. The existence of eunuchs as valuable commodities also had profound implications for African societies from which they were taken. The removal of young men in large numbers disrupted the demographic balance of communities, leaving deficits in the male population that affected labor, defense, and social structures. Villages faced long-term consequences as families struggled to maintain agricultural productivity, transmit cultural practices, and uphold governance systems without the presence of a generation of men who had been forcibly castrated and removed. The psychological ripple effects of these losses, grief, fear, and enduring trauma permeated entire communities, embedding in collective memory a persistent awareness of vulnerability and the human cost of distant profits extracted through violence and coercion. Within the Arab societies that purchased and employed eunuchs, these individuals were both central to the functioning of elite institutions and symbols of the complex, morally fraught nature of wealth derived from human subjugation. Their labor and presence enabled the smooth operation of courts, harems, and administrative structures, yet their humanity was largely denied, reduced to a combination of obedience, physical utility, and social symbolism. The perception of eunuchs as uniquely valuable reinforced the incentive for slave traders to perpetuate the practice. Intertwining commerce, social hierarchy, and cultural expectation in a system that normalized the commodification and bodily violation of children. The long-term consequences of this trade were profound. Eunuchs who survived were often isolated from both their cultural roots and familial ties, living lives defined by service, alienation, and the inescapable mark of physical mutilation. Their existence in elite households and political structures highlighted both the economic logic and the social ideologies that underpinned the practice, serving as a living reminder of the intersection between human cruelty and calculated utility. The wider African societies, meanwhile, continued to bear the scars of mass removals, demographic imbalances, and the cultural disruptions wrought by the extraction of young men, a legacy that persisted in social memory and structural inequalities for generations. The story of eunuchs in the Arab slave trade also provides insight into the broader mechanisms of human exploitation and the ways in which economic incentives can be tragically aligned with systems of oppression. The high market value of castrated males did not emerge in isolation. It was deeply entwined with social hierarchies, labor demands, and cultural beliefs about loyalty, purity, and control. Traders, slave owners, and ruling elites collectively reinforced a cycle in which the dehumanization of children became normalized, perpetuating suffering across continents and centuries. Observing this history forces a recognition of both the resilience of those who endured and the structural forces that shaped their lives, offering a lens through which to understand the interplay of commerce, violence, and human dignity in one of history's darkest chapters. By tracing the economic, social, and cultural dimensions of the trade in eunuchs, we see how a single practice, the forced castration of young African males, could generate extraordinary profits while inflicting incalculable suffering, disrupting societies, and leaving a lasting imprint on both the lands from which individuals were taken and the households that employed them. The enduring legacy of this practice is a testament to the ways in which human exploitation was systematized, normalized, and justified across centuries, underscoring the need to remember, reflect, and learn from the profound consequences of prioritizing profit over life, autonomy, and the fundamental dignity of every human being. The persistence of slavery across centuries in the Arab world was not merely a product of economic desire or opportunistic trade. It was also underpinned and rationalized by the intellectual and religious frameworks of the time, in which certain Islamic scholars provided theological and legal justifications that gave the practice a veneer of legitimacy, enabling its continuation even as the human cost mounted and voices of conscience, both within and outside the Muslim world, condemned its cruelty. These scholars, writing from positions of influence within their communities, drew upon interpretations of sacred texts and historical precedent to argue that slavery could be morally and legally acceptable, particularly when the individuals enslaved were considered to have belonged to societies or faiths previously outside the domain of Islam. Conversion to Islam by captives did not necessarily abolish their status as slaves. Instead, the institution of servitude was framed as compatible with their new religious identity, so long as property rights in the individual had already been established. This rationalization created a legalistic framework that both normalized and perpetuated the enslavement of Africans, embedding the practice into social, economic, and cultural systems across the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. Historical writings from the region reveal the nuances of these arguments, showing how scholars sought to reconcile religious law with the practical realities of commerce, conquest, and governance. Some asserted that slavery was an acceptable consequence of unbelief, treating it as a continuation of existing servitude that predated conversion, or as a natural outcome of social hierarchies in which certain peoples were deemed more capable of enslavement due to their prior faith or cultural status. This intellectual framework lent authority to the trade, allowing slave traders, owners, and political leaders to act with a sense of religious sanction, effectively insulating them from moral scrutiny and discouraging internal dissent. Such endorsements also helped to perpetuate the system through generations. As families, governments, and merchants continued practices that were framed as lawful, necessary, and even righteous, with resistance often framed as defiance of divinely sanctioned order. The consequences of this scholarly legitimization were profound and far-reaching. By embedding slavery within theological discourse, the Arab slave trade gained a form of social and cultural endurance that economic or coercive force alone could not have achieved. It created a climate in which the buying, selling, and exploitation of human beings became woven into everyday life, tolerated and even accepted as part of the moral and legal fabric of society. This intellectual backing reinforced the demand for enslaved Africans, including women, children, and castrated males, and made the trans-Saharan, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean slave routes vital arteries of commerce whose operation depended on the tacit approval of religious and civic authorities. Traders and rulers could continue their operations without fear of censure, while enslaved individuals were left with little hope of recourse, trapped in a system sanctioned by both law and belief. The psychological and social impact of this endorsement extended beyond the markets and palaces where slaves were held. Communities in Africa witnessed the removal of young men, women, and children, often at the hands of neighbors or intermediaries who acted within the accepted norms established by religious authorities, creating a sense of inevitability and helplessness. Families understood that their loved ones were not simply victims of economic exploitation, but participants in a system that religious scholarship claimed was permissible, a recognition that complicated grief with social and moral resignation. Survivors carried the burden of trauma, aware that the suffering they endured was not only condoned but rationalized by the highest forms of local authority, embedding deep and lasting scars on collective memory, trust, and social cohesion. Furthermore, the legitimization of slavery influenced the structures into which African captives were placed, including domestic service, harems, administrative roles, and labor in plantations or dangerous industries. The religious and legal endorsement of slavery meant that captives were treated as property, often with rigid hierarchies and rules that further dehumanized them, while owners were reassured that they acted in accordance with social and divine law. The interplay between legal sanction and economic motivation created a self-reinforcing cycle. As the value of enslaved individuals increased, particularly eunuchs or skilled laborers, so too did the incentive to perpetuate the practice. while theological justification quelled questions of morality or ethics that might otherwise have restrained it. Even as the centuries progressed and the rest of the world moved toward abolition, these intellectual frameworks contributed to the remarkable longevity of slavery in Arab societies, delaying meaningful legal and social reform. Nations such as Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, and Mauritania abolished slavery far later than Western countries, and enforcement of these bans was often weak, inconsistent, or accompanied by compensation schemes that favored slave owners over victims. The persistence of slavery into the 20th century, despite international pressure and moral critique, underscores how deeply embedded the practice had become, sustained not only by profit and coercion, but also by religious and legal rationalizations that provided moral cover for acts of extreme violence, dehumanization, and systemic exploitation. By examining the theological justifications for slavery, we gain insight into how ideology can be mobilized to sustain systems of oppression, creating structures in which human suffering is normalized and perpetuated. The Arab slave trade, sustained over 13 centuries, demonstrates that exploitation is not merely a matter of force or opportunity, but can also be reinforced by the frameworks through which societies interpret morality, law, and human value. The use of religious scholarship to legitimize the trade ensured that practices such as the castration of male captives, sexual exploitation of women, and brutal forced labor could continue largely unchecked, embedding long-term consequences into both the societies of origin and the receiving cultures. Reflecting on this history allows us to understand the interconnectedness of belief, commerce, and coercion, revealing how systems of human exploitation can endure when supported by intellectual and moral authority. The legacy of these justifications is visible not only in the lives of those who survived and their descendants, but also in the demographic, social, and cultural landscapes of affected African regions. Recognizing how religious rationalization reinforced and prolonged the Arab slave trade highlights the critical importance of questioning authority, ethical reasoning, and the enduring consequences of aligning belief systems with structures of human oppression, ensuring that the lessons of history continue to inform contemporary reflections on justice, dignity, and the protection of human life. As we reach the close of this harrowing journey through one of history's darkest chapters, it becomes painfully clear that the Arab slave trade, despite its staggering scale, profound brutality, and centuries-long endurance, has been largely overshadowed in global memory and public discourse, receiving far less recognition than other forms of slavery that occurred in the Americas or Europe. Tens of millions of Africans were captured, transported across vast earths, shipped across oceans, subjected to unimaginable suffering, and forcibly altered through practices such as castration, all while being removed from their homes, families, and cultural roots. Yet, despite the enormity of this tragedy and the deep generational trauma it inflicted on countless communities, it is seldom discussed in school curricula, rarely commemorated in public memorials, and often absent from mainstream histories of slavery. The stories of those who endured, who suffered and perished, and whose societies were irrevocably disrupted have been muted or erased, leaving a silence that must now be broken if we are to truly honor the human lives affected and the historical truths that deserve acknowledgement. The lack of international recognition for the Arab slave trade is not merely a matter of oversight. It reflects the selective nature of historical memory, in which certain narratives are amplified while others are marginalized or suppressed. Whereas the transatlantic slave trade has been memorialized through museums, days of remembrance, scholarly research, and widespread public discussion, the Arab slave trade spanning over 13 centuries and encompassing regions from the Sahara Desert to the Middle East and Indian Ocean remains largely invisible, leaving descendants and communities affected by its legacy without the formal acknowledgement or restorative justice that they deserve. This erasure perpetuates injustice by denying the full scope of human suffering, impeding understanding of historical causality, and limiting opportunities for global reflection and learning. Yet even in the face of neglect, the stories of resilience, endurance, and survival among enslaved Africans and their descendants endure, offering powerful lessons about human strength and the capacity to persevere under circumstances that seem insurmountable. By revisiting these narratives, we are reminded of the indomitable spirit of those who lived through unimaginable violence, the families who sought to maintain connections despite forced separations, and the cultural traditions that persisted despite systematic attempts to erase identity and memory. Acknowledging the Arab slave trade and its impact allows us to confront uncomfortable truths about human history, to challenge lingering prejudices, and to appreciate the resilience of communities that have survived both the trauma of slavery and the neglect of historical memory. Commemorating this history also provides an opportunity to reflect on the broader mechanisms of human exploitation and the ways in which economic, social, and ideological structures can combine to justify acts of immense cruelty. The Arab slave trade was not only a product of commerce and conquest, but also reinforced through legal, religious, and cultural rationalizations that normalized the dehumanization of African peoples. Understanding this context helps us grasp the complexity of slavery as a historical phenomenon and encourages vigilance against any contemporary practices or ideologies that might devalue human life or justify inequality. By studying and sharing these stories, we honor the humanity of those who were silenced, and we equip ourselves to recognize and confront injustice wherever it appears in the present day. In sharing this narrative, we are also called to remember the individuals behind the statistics: the young boys and girls marched across deserts, the men castrated to serve as eunuchs, the women forced into harems, the countless families torn apart, and the entire societies disrupted for generations. Their suffering, courage, and resilience must be remembered not only as historical fact, but as a moral imperative that challenges us to bear witness, to educate others, and to ensure that such atrocities are neither forgotten nor repeated. It is through memory, acknowledgement, and open dialogue that the victims' voices gain life beyond the confines of history books, asserting their rightful place in global consciousness and human empathy. As we reflect on this sobering history, it is important to commit to spreading awareness, engaging in informed discussion, and supporting the work of historians, educators, and activists who are dedicated to uncovering and sharing these suppressed stories. By doing, we participate in a form of moral restitution, acknowledging both the scale of human suffering and the courage of those who endured it. Each act of learning, sharing, and commemorating becomes a small step toward honoring the humanity of millions who were denied justice, freedom, and recognition for far too long. Thank you deeply for joining this exploration of a history that has been too long overlooked, for listening with care and empathy, and for committing to remember what has been hidden. If you found this narrative illuminating, insightful, or important, please like this video, share it with friends and family, and subscribe to the channel to support our continued efforts in uncovering untold stories and shining light on overlooked chapters of human history. Your engagement not only helps keep these stories alive but ensures that awareness continues to grow, fostering a more informed, empathetic, and conscious world. From the shadows of this past, let us honor memory with knowledge, let us confront injustice with awareness, and let us remember that, by acknowledging the forgotten, we give voice to those who can no longer speak. Thank you once again for watching, for reflecting, and for being part of this journey into understanding, remembrance, and respect.